Okay, good evening and welcome to the panel Teens and Temptations Navigating Modern Day Risks. Thank you all for being here tonight. This panel is especially meaningful because it is our first in the virtual panel series leading up to the Youth Mental Wellness Fair on January 25th. Through these conversations, our goal is to equip the parents and caregivers with credible information, practical tools, and expert guidance before we come together in person as a community. My name is Shilpa Kulkarni. I am the co-founder and president of Shiv's Third Eye, a New Jersey-based nonprofit established in memory of my son, Shiv, whom we lost to mental health, to suicide. Shiv's Third Eye was created with a focus on education, early awareness, support, and stigma reduction for youth mental health because we believe that informed parents, connected communities, and open conversations can truly save lives. While this work is deeply personal for me, tonight's conversation is completely grounded in science, clinical expertise, and real world experience. This is not about fear or blame. It's about understanding risk, strengthening connections, and empowering parents. This is a safe, judgment free space. Audience on Facebook and YouTube, please feel free to state the question in the comments and we will try to address as the time permits. It is my privilege to introduce our panelists this evening. First, Dr. Danielle Dick. Dr. Danielle Dick is a tenured professor of psychiatry at Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, where she serves as the inaugural director of the Rutgers Addiction Research Center at the Brain Health Institute and holds the Greg Brown Endowed Chair in Neuroscience. She is an internationally recognized, award-winning expert on the genetic and environmental influences on human behavior, with over 450 publications and more than 55 million in NIH-funded research. Dr. Dick is also the author of The Child Code and co-founder of Thrive Genetics. Her team developed the Comprehensive Addiction Risk Evaluation System, CARES, which integrates advances in genomics and epidemiology to help families think proactively about risk and healthier outcomes. We are honored to have her with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, Shilpa.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dick. Joining her is Nicholas Urban, a licensed clinical social worker, DBT skills trainer, and substance use program coordinator at Metro NY DBT Center with extensive experience working with adolescents and families. Nick received his Master's of Science in Social Work from Columbia University, where he got trained in DBT and CBT. These are the terms most of the people would know, but if not, we can always explain it later. Prior to joining Metro NY DBT Center, he was a senior director at Breaking Ground, a nonprofit provider of housing and street outreach, and worked in substance use research at Columbia University Medical Center and the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Nick has experience in both inpatient and outpatient settings and currently focuses on DBT and DBT for substance use disorders at Metro NY's Manhattan and New Jersey offices. Nick brings a critical on-the-ground perspective, what teens are actually experiencing today and what truly helps in real life. Thank you, Nick, for coming tonight.
Thanks very much for having me.
Okay, are we live? Okay. Dr. Danielle, to set the foundation for this entire series, can you help us understand what is so special about adolescence and risk-taking behavior And what makes today's environment spatially challenging for teens compared to really our times? I don't want to give out our age, but really our times. And
Not
also,
a teenager anymore. Yes, I think that fits for all of us. Well, there's a lot in that question. And I'm so glad that you're facilitating this conversation tonight. I think we need to step back and first think about what makes us as parents of teenagers. I have one as well, and a tween too coming along too. One of the things is that we really need to think about adolescent risk-taking behavior in the context of brain development. So what do we know about what's going on in our kids' brains? You used to hear a lot about raging hormones, and that's why teenagers were doing all the crazy things they were doing. But actually, we know that a much bigger factor that contributes to teens' behavior is really what's going on in their brain development. So one of the things that we know is that the teenage years are a period of really rapid brain development. So teens' brains are developing as fast as they're ever going to in their life up until about age 25. The only time that brains develop more rapidly is in the first year of life. So think about everything that happens from having like a brand new infant to when you have a toddler. And now imagine that though you can't see those changes quite as rapidly in a teenager, that's what's going on in their brains. And so when we talk about brain development, we talk about it being asynchronous, which just simply means that brains don't mature all at once. Some parts mature earlier and other parts mature later. And the parts that are fully mature in your teenagers are essentially, what some of us talk about as the gas pedal, right? It's the part of our brains that respond to reward, to things that feel good, to things that are novel and exciting. And there's good evolutionary reason for that. Historically, this is when individuals reach reproductive age. They would have to leave their tribes, find mates, essentially produce offspring because they weren't going to live that long. So there's a lot of reasons evolutionarily why that part of our brain would develop first.
right.
Part of our teenagers' brains that is not fully developed, the last part to develop, which is not done until around age 25 or so, is the prefrontal cortex, that front part of the brain right behind your forehead that helps you think through long-term consequences and planning. And so we can talk more about what this means for teen risk behavior, but when you have a brain that gets really excited by novel new things that are right in front of them, and the part of the brain that is not fully developed is the part that maybe causes you to pause and think, is this a good idea? What will my parents think? Am I going to get in trouble? Well, how am I going to feel the next day? What are the long-term consequences? Their brains just don't have the same ability to think those things through as fully developed adult brains do.
Yeah, so that actually, I know we have heard about prefrontal cortex, prefrontal lobe, right? That we have heard, and now it makes sense when you have explained it. Now, my question is, how is that different from our times? Because we went through that similar stuff. So, what are the challenges that the kids now, because we are so much, is it just because we have become parents and we have started thinking about it? Or is it real that there are much more risks right now, what kids are facing versus our times?
Yeah, so the second part of your question about what about kids these days? So there are some similarities between teenagers through the generations, as we just talked about. Many of us might have engaged in some risk-taking behavior and exploratory behavior when we are teenagers. What is really different for teens is the landscape of possible risk behaviors and substances. And so what I mean by that is that actually in some ways, when it comes to alcohol use, risky sex, etc., actually there's data that kids these days, this generation, are making fewer risky choices, and we can talk about that. But if we think first about substances, instead what we have are powerful drugs with respect to fentanyl being laced into much of our drug system, cannabis being legalized, so there's increased access, acceptance, and it's a far more potent version of the drug than existed when we were younger. We can talk more about that. And then, of course, what we have is all of the online gambling, gaming, social media platforms, which are actually designed to tap into those very features of brain development that keep you excited and hooked onto things. So if you imagine these platforms are developed to essentially cause our brains to quickly and repeatedly get that rewarding feeling, well, now you take teenagers whose brains are really even more primed toward responding to that rewarding feeling. And that's why many of those platforms where we worry about our teens becoming, quote, their behavioral addictions, becoming addicted or sucked into some of these new technologies that didn't exist when we were younger.
Yeah, thank you. So coming back to now the practical, what Nick, you are seeing in your practice, in your everyday experience, what sort of are these like in line with what you see in terms of the teenagers that you are kind of seeing? The other question that I probably have for you is when you see these teens going through some sort of addictive behavior or participating in the risky behavior, what is it, what kind of risks are the ones which parents underestimate the most?
Great question. Absolutely. It's in line with what we're seeing in our practice with folks today. That trend with less alcohol use and increased cannabis use, marijuana, I prefer to call it THC at this point, the active compound, because the routes of administration have changed so much. And when we're thinking about generations past, right? You think about the 60s and 70s when
Yeah,
that active
exactly.
drug, right? The
Yeah,
THC concentration at that time was maybe 2-3%. You see a gradual increase over subsequent decades in the 80s and the 90s where it doesn't get that much higher, right? Up to 5, maybe 6%, right? Fast forward into the 2000s, and now, right, just the actual plant version of it that's cultivated, you're seeing something like 25%, right? Just the smokable plant, right? So that right there is a 10 plus times increase, right? But the route
exactly.
of administration for THC now that's available to kids, especially with the legalization that's happened, particularly in this area, in the New York, New
New
Jersey
Jersey.
area. Now
Yeah,
you have beverages, right? Soda, essentially, or lemonades and so forth. You have gummy candy, right? You have vapes, right? Not just for THC, but for nicotine as well, a relatively new technology. And then there are other routes of administration, oils, tinctures. There's a product called Shatter that's a really concentrated resin where the THC content can get up to 90%. So we're talking about, your grandfather's grass, right, which was quite literally barely not grass, right? To fast forward to 2026, where you can get a product that it goes from 2% to 90%, right? The only comparison I can really make for, I think, most relatable, if you were drinking a light beer, and instead of drinking that pint of beer, suddenly you were drinking a pint of moonshine, right? That's the kind of intensity of potency that we're talking about. THC or marijuana has often been considered natural, a plant. There's a real
yeah.
wellness
We
kind
have
of
heard that
marketing
all the
campaign that goes along with it. Hell, it's medically prescribed, pardon my language. And at the same time, we're dealing with a drug that is so potent and has such powerful effects, particularly on the young, developing brain, as Danielle mentioned, that things like impulsivity, right, risk awareness, and so forth can become totally compromised. So I think that right, the potency and then the availability
time.
in different forms, right? In the past, it was a plant, it was bulky. You could smoke it and you'd be able to smell it, right? There were really clear kind of indicators. Now, a scentless, kind of odorless vape, a gummy, a drink, right? These kinds of things are more accessible than they've ever been before at a potency that I think is misunderstood by a lot of people.
That is actually so true. I mean, now that you mention it, my kids used to kind of joke about it because they call me that I have a very good nose. I could smell a cigarette from, 100 feet or, weed or whatever. So they would always say, oh, we could never get away with mom not finding out. But now, as you said, like the gummies and the liquid and vapes, like we can't even keep up with all these stuff, like the cut and this and that, whatever the names they come up with. So as parents, how much can we really keep sort of learning more and more? So going back to actually Dr. Danielle, you were talking about the brain. Now, what Nick said is there is just huge potency, and the difference in the drugs or the difference in the risks that we are really, I think it was the conversation that I had with Nick or Dr. Danielle. You kind of said that they are carrying a bar or a casino in their pocket with the phone, right? Basically, you are literally, you can get anywhere gambling, you can get any of the bad stuff, like almost in your phone. So considering that, what is the effect of that teenage underdeveloped brain versus a parent who thinks that it's okay to have natural weed?
I'm so glad that Nick raised all that. That is also one of my total soapbox issues, is raising awareness, exactly as you were saying, Shilpa, because so many parents do not fully appreciate just how different, these THC products are. And so when it comes to a developing brain, one of the other frightening things about how rapidly things have changed with cannabis products is that we're basically doing a huge experiment right now with this next generation, because the legalization has happened so much faster than the research. And that is actually because marijuana has been, I would argue, as do many in this field, misclassified as a Schedule I drug, meaning, it's as dangerous, that those are drugs that are considered highly dangerous with no medical use. There are some instances, very narrow, where cannabis has been shown to have some medicinal benefits. But the vast majority of the things, as Nick was saying, that they're marketed for health and wellness reasons are not true. But that said, and it's clearly not as potent or dangerous as some of these other drugs. The downside to that, because people might think, well, what's the harm in, making it, harder to obtain? Well, there's been almost no research done on this, because with these Schedule I drugs, you have to get them from a certain highly controlled government laboratory, like if you want to do research on LSD or cocaine or things,
Right.
and you get them from these laboratories, and you can only do research on that. Well, guess what? The cannabis products are that we can get from these highly controlled laboratories. They're the 3% THC of 20 years ago. So there's almost no research on what these extremely potent drugs that we know teens now are more likely to be using daily than they are to alcohol, right? Because alcohol's harder to hide for all the reasons Nick talked about. So we don't know really what it's doing to developing brains, except we know it's not good. And the early evidence suggests the biggest things it impacts are memory and motivation. We see this in animal studies, and we see this in some of the first kind of correlational studies we can do. And candidly, the other place that we started seeing it first was in reports of our counseling centers, because if you think about teenagers and, early young adults, what is their job, if you will? Their job is to get themselves to school, right? Or to a job, to care about doing well, whether that's grades or actually your performance at your job. And so the idea that they can use these drugs regularly, they're highly potent, they're affecting kids' memory and motivation. What we're seeing is that things start falling apart and they don't really even care because that's one of the nefarious parts of that drug. Um, and the last piece I'll say is the other thing we know about these, highly addictive substances and behavioral platforms, right, that activate the reward pathways, they do it much better than natural rewards. Why do these pathways exist in our brains? Because we need to eat, we need to seek shelter, right? Things, warmth, whether that's the warmth of another person from a good relationship, whether that's literal warmth, whether it is eating, whether it's sexual relations. Those are all things that help the human species survive. So they activate our reward pathways. So our brains go, do more of that. It helped us survive. But you know what activates the reward pathways much better than even other friends or people you love or, naturally rewarding things like being involved in your community or sports?
You're right.
Drugs and these platforms which were designed to activate. And once the brain becomes accustomed to that really big, as they sometimes call dopamine hit, these activations, then the normally rewarding things,
Don't,
spending time
yeah.
with your friends, doing well in school. I love my husband and children very much, but they are not 100% rewarding in every single interaction I have with them, right? Drugs, on the other hand, always produce that rewarding effect. You might need more and more of them to get the same rewarding effect, but that's part of the problem. And that's part of why they become so addictive, right? They then start to change the brain such that it only wants these high potent rewards and everything else starts to sort of feel, boring.
Yeah, no, it is. So I'm actually, when you are talking, my brain is going another 100 miles an hour. One of the things that I have always questioned and thought about it, because what comes first? A lot of times, the kids who are getting addicted, like sometimes it is maybe experimentation, which is like, oh, let me just try. I'm pretty sure the dopamine that we saw, talked about, the brain development that is not there, which is looking and seeking risky behavior, and that's why we are trying to put something ahead of us. But equally, there are other cases or other times when it's because of the depression, it's because of something that I do not feel good. How do I go and try to feel good? And that's when they are also seeking this. How many, like, if you think about, and I think maybe this is a question for Nick probably, or maybe if you have done a research in that area, what percentage of kids seek it out because they are already feeling down, and what percentage of kids probably go start experimentation and then they start like feeling down, and then the comorbidities and whatever we can think about?
I think it's hard to say an exact percentage in this kind of
Yeah,
chicken
rough. I mean,
egg
I would say.
scenario, right? A lot of the folks that we work with in our practice, right, in an outpatient practice, present with that kind of comorbidity, dual diagnosis with a mental health condition as well as substance use. Kind of parsing that apart, I would say that it's not the norm that someone just seeks out substance use in such a kind of methodical way, especially at that young age. Like, I'm feeling depressed. What can I do? I'm going to try to find drugs to make myself feel better. It's really more, I think, access is a major
It
component
is
of what we
access.
see,
Yeah.
whether it's access in the home, whether it's access through a social group, right? Whether more and more it's access in the community with legalization and so forth. Um, but oftentimes, substance use either starts in a more experimental way, and then because of that massive neurochemical response that Danielle was just describing, suddenly hanging out with friends or, I don't know, uh, spending time with family, hobbies, sports, whatever, like all the things that kids are typically involved in start to pale in comparison, right? And then that just takes up more and more of the time. And the thing is, when you're then kind of withdrawing from that neurochemical blast that you get, right, then those manifest as symptoms that look very similar to mental health symptoms, right? So difficulty sleeping, appetite disruption, mood impact, right? Increased anxiety, and then the apathy that she described as well, right? So it's not like you can just drop back and then go back to what you were doing and just kind of re-regulate and normalize. So that's why it can become so insidious, right? When that pattern gets set up. Also, right, if people are actually already experiencing some of these mental health conditions that we're talking about, your anxiety, your depression, and so forth, and they do get relief from a substance, there are very few things that can change the way you feel just like that, the way that drugs of abuse can, right? No matter what it is. So these other kind of solutions, meaningful activity, engaging socially, and so forth, right? They're just not necessarily going to do it, especially if you have a sudden onset of mental health conditions, which we tend to see when folks are in their adolescence, right? They're kind of
Yeah.
like early, mid to late adolescence is when a lot of this stuff first comes on. So again, because of that timing, it can be hard to tell kind of which came
What
first
comes
and then
first?
which has kind of exacerbated the other. But they have this kind of mutually reinforcing effect, and there's this real transactional model that we see at play. And then almost in like a cascading effect, as they potentially become less engaged in things like school, social activities, extracurricular activities, right? There's a kind of downward spiral that can happen.
Yeah. So I think in an other side of it, maybe Dr. Daniel, you can say like this was more from the actual, in the clinic experience. Now, when it comes to we have heard about genetic susceptibility, right? Like I think your papers and your research is in that. So what is the difference in like, or how much of it is genetic susceptibility and how much of it is environmental triggers? Now we are talking about access being environmental trigger, peer pressure could be environmental trigger, and just risky behavior at that young age could be environmental trigger. But how much of it is genetically, you are at risk to that kind of risky behavior or addictive personality, they call it, right? Like the substance use or addictive personality. How do we differentiate that?
Yeah. So different parts of the process are influenced by genetics and environment to different degrees, right? So from a prevention standpoint, no one wakes up one morning and is like, oh my gosh, I had an onset of alcohol use disorder overnight, right? Or opioid use disorder. There's usually a trajectory of risk-related behavior, which has to start in the area of in the development of substance use problems with initiating and trying a substance, right? Then moving into more regular patterns of use, and then for some developing problems. And that initiation step tends to be more environmentally influenced because exactly as Nick was saying, guess what it takes for kids to initiate substance use? They need access to it. And so that is a place where actually as parents, we really can influence that and in helping kids delay it. Our job is harder because they can get things online, as we were talking about earlier. I mean, you can,
Everywhere.
just Google cannabis products or THC and you will have some eye-opening, slick, bright colors, fun websites where you can order things right off the web just by clicking, yes, I'm 18. So our job is harder, but we do still have some control over, are they accessing alcohol or other drugs in our home? Are we monitoring who they're with, where they're going, those kinds of things, which we know reduce the initiation of substance use and regular use. So the bigger question of why do some people develop problems and others don't? The reality is experimentation and some degree of wanting to try new things is totally normal in adolescence. And in fact, there's good things associated with that, right? We want our kids to try new things. It's normal that they want to figure themselves out, right? So I feel like we need to acknowledge that piece of things. What we know is that when it comes to why some people develop problems and others don't, because in our society, most people try a substance at some point, right? 85% of people choose to use alcohol or other drugs recreationally. We know that about half of the differences between why some people are more likely to develop problems than others are due to differences in their DNA. And about half of the differences between people and maybe how much they choose to use or the likelihood they'll develop problems is due to differences in their environment. Now, what that does not mean is that if, me, Danielle Dick, develops a problem, it's 50% due to my genes and 50% due to my environment. The way we are all a product of our own genes and environment. And the way we conceptualize it for people is imagine we all have a mental health jar. So picture those clear glass mason jars, right? And when that jar is full, that's when someone is actively experiencing problems. So they have a substance use disorder, maybe they meet criteria for depression or anxiety. What are the things that can make that jar full? Genes and environment. So we're born with our genetic makeup. So imagine we all start life with a jar with some marbles in the bottom of it, right? And that's our genetic risk, how many genetic risk factors we have. Some people are lucky. They just have a few little risk marbles at the beginning, which means it's going to take a lot more, environmental rocks, if you will, or big rocks, right? Maybe big traumas or things to fill up that jar. Some people, a lot of us fall somewhere in the middle, but some people are really unlucky and their jar is 3/4 of the way full, which means it's not going to take as many environmental risk factors to develop problems. Now, that said, hopefully the jar model also kind of helps you think about how recovery and treatment are possible and prevention. So what do we think about, recovery? What are we trying to do? We're trying to take out some of those environmental rocks, right? And replace with healthier kinds of things. So when it comes to prevention, we're essentially putting rings on top of the neck of that jar. So it's even taller. So you can take more before you're developing problems because you have other healthy resilience things in place. Family members, supportive friends, environments that are, for example, substance free, enriching activities and jobs and those sorts of things. So we are all a product of both our genes and our environments. And one of the things that has come from advances in genetics, and we can talk more about this, later if this is of interest, is that we know a lot about what are those genetic risk factors and the ways in which they show up early before substances ever come online. So how do genetic predispositions show up in kids, in young children, et cetera, so we can use that for prevention.
Wow. Yeah. No, that jar analogy was perfect. Absolutely. So would neurodiversity or ADHD, autism, all of these, are these additional risks? Like, are those marbles in the jars?
So what we have learned is that there's, we kind of conceptualize it as 3 big genetic risk pathways, right? So, and we all have different combinations of them. You can carry risk across multiple pathways. But the first one everybody always thinks of, and I think is what most people imagine when we talk about genetic risk towards substance use problems, is the way bodies respond to a drug. If I take this drug, I'm more likely to become physiologically dependent than the next person. There's a little bit of truth to that. There are genes that influence the way our bodies process substances. And that's why some people get a major rush from opioids, and other people, it makes them so nauseous, they can't imagine how people get addicted. With alcohol, right? Some people actually carry versions of genes, which means they can't break down kind of the toxic byproduct. It makes them really sick. It's really hard to develop problems when every time you drink, you feel really sick. It's hard to drink enough to develop problems.
Lucky people.
So there are some genes involved in metabolism, like how your body processes it, how much you like it. But most of the way that our genes influence risk for substance use problems is not specific to substances, and it's not about the way bodies respond to drugs. It's about the way our brains are wired. And this is related to how our brains are wired differently to process rewards and risks. And so we talked about teenagers in general have brains that are not fully developed when it comes to thinking things through. But, it's a bell curve as to where we fall on our comfort level toward risk taking and toward impulsivity. And so you see the people that, love racing down the side of mountains, and other people that think, "Ooh, I'd rather stick to the bunny slope," right? You see the little kids that are at the top of the swing sets, on the top yelling like, "Look at me," giving parents heart attacks. And you see the other ones who are standing at the bottom going, "Ooh, that looks really scary." Things like how our brains process rewards and risk taking show up very early. And we know that it shows up as impulsivity. It can then show up as ADHD. It can show up as behavior problems. And those are the exact same set of genes that also then influence the development of substance use problems. And the reason that we really try and raise awareness of this is because it means if your child is more of the impulsive risk taker and, is maybe displaying some of these other challenges, that in fact helping kids, this is where Nick and comes in and whatnot, helping kids learn emotional and behavioral regulation, putting in place strategies for ADHD and managing challenging behaviors, etc., in a family system, that can actually reduce the likelihood that kids will engage in some of these other behaviors we worry about, like substance use. The last risk pathway, which I'll mention briefly, is the other thing that you and Nick were talking about, which is our brains all differ in how they process fear and anxiety and worry. Some of us have brains that make us more predisposed toward anxiety and worry. And if good skills and coping strategies are not put in place, then when substances are tried and people realize, oh, this is a powerful way to manage this, not a healthy way, but can be a powerful way, then we sometimes see that being an indirect way that genes have influenced our brain wiring that can then influence substance use problems. But by kind of knowing particularly about these other pathways, because they show up early, it also allows a lot of opportunity to intervene when parents understand that.
It's interesting when you say when parents understand that. The more, even while helping Shiv, I always felt it like that as a parent, if I'm not a psychiatrist and a psychologist, I have failed my child. A lot of times you do feel like that, and I used to feel like that. But it is like modern parenting, I think, is very, very hard. I'm sure you guys also know that. So you spoke so much about it, like the different coping skills and initial how you develop those, how you speak to the kids. Now, Nick, this is a question for you because I don't think all of us, culturally as such, I come from Indian background, so as it is culturally, we don't necessarily go to psychiatrist or psychologist, in general therapist. But either way, parents don't think of taking their children to the therapy right away, right? So without even having like prevention being the center of what our discussion is, how do actually, what kind of skills, whether CBT or DBT, that you develop are the skills that parents can reinforce at home, especially in like really tough moments when we are preteens. I would say preteens already start those tough moments around that, right? And even like, how do we actually keep tab on them? Do we do so? What kind of prevention, um, for parents? I'm talking about, this is parents. What can they do so that their kids have a little bit of those rings? I'm going to go back to that jar and the rings that you mentioned, because nobody knows what kind of marbles are there in the jar, right? So how do we develop?
It's a nice way to put it. Yeah, I mean, the thing that I would emphasize the most is just to have involvement, right, and curiosity, and kind of as open a line of communication as you can maintain, right? So approaching in a way that's genuinely curious and observant, right, and non-judgmental, right? Genuinely wanting to know, like, what's happening, what are you doing, who are you spending time with, what are you interested in, right? That's the curiosity side of things. From an observance standpoint, have you noticed a change in how your kid's behaving? Right? Is their schoolwork changing? Is their socialization changing? Is their interest in activities changing? Are they spending more time kind of isolated or by themselves? Are they spending time with people and you're not sure who they are? Right? Have their friend group changed? That kind of thing. I think paying attention to, and then again, not saying, hey, what's going on with this, but like getting curious. Like, hey, I've noticed that XYZ, right? You're not hanging out with so and so anymore. You seem to be hanging out with different people. Seems like school's been tougher for you, or it's been harder for you to get up in the morning, right? What's going on, right? Anything that you can tell me, or anything that you've noticed, right? So that curiosity and interest, right? That's the first and foremost thing I would say. Um, from an actual practical, sorry, Danielle, did you want to jump in as well?
No, go
Oh,
ahead, and then I'll add
okay.
on to it.
From a practical kind of like skills standpoint, right? One of the things that we emphasize the most with folks that we're already working with or in treatment is meaningful activity in general. So kids who have a lot of unstructured time, kids who have time where there's not tons of supervision. Now, granted, as you become an adolescent and there's more and more independence, that's naturally going to occur and should occur, right? That's part of development. But making sure that this activity is, when I say meaningful activity, it could be any number of things, right? It could be time with friends. It could be stuff that's more recreational. It could be hobbies. It could be sports. It could be extracurricular activities, right? But having that time filled with activities that are going to engage someone so that they're not there kind of looking to impulsively fill some of that need. And then the skills that we focus on really specifically, particularly from the DBT or the dialectical behavior
Yeah.
therapy world, is a real focus on kind of awareness of emotional responses, right? Things we can do to regulate our emotion, right? So that we have a kind of lower baseline to begin with, so that when these inevitable stressors that everyone experiences, but that I think kids and adolescents definitely experience, right?
Yeah.
Internally and in the external environment, can we try to keep that baseline lower so that when those things come up, it doesn't just put you right through the ceiling into crisis mode? And if you are at a point where things have become so difficult, we look at distress tolerance skills as well, right? When you're in that kind of full blown emotional state of mind, there's a whole series of things that you can potentially do to distract yourself, right? To kind of improve the moment with all kinds of things like relaxation techniques, breathing techniques, imagery techniques, right? And then we also look at physiological changes as well. How can you kind of almost game your body in a way? And we think about things like, intense physical exercise, very specific pace breathing exercises, playing around with temperature, ice, and so forth, because we're just trying to survive those tough moments, right? And
Mm.
not make the situation worse by potentially turning to something like substance use to try to then manage our emotional state. Um, so stuff that they can do, stuff that parents can do, but that's really just scratching the surface, I feel like.
But
And
it's
Shifa,
never, sorry.
the piece I wanted to add is that these questions you're grappling with about how to make decisions about when do I take my kids to see someone, do they need to see someone,
Exactly.
etc. These are questions that all parents grapple with. I mean, I used to jokingly think to myself, I have a PhD in clinical psychology, and it's so hard to tell because most of us don't have, 20 children to compare, all of them to each other. And the reason it's so challenging is because behavior is on a bell curve. And we are making somewhat arbitrary lines and saying people above this level, the questions I always get from parents is it impulsivity? Or does my
Exactly.
child have ADHD? Are they just an anxious child or do they have clinical anxiety? Are they using substances heavily or is this a substance use disorder? And I say, well, that's actually the wrong question to ask because it's on a bell curve. We kind of make these arbitrary decisions in a sense as to how much it's interfering with a person's life. But the people that I know that are the quickest to seek help from psychologists, from psychiatrists, are other psychologists and psychiatrists because we realize it's very hard to make those differentiations and we can all use some help, right? We can all use some help
Exactly. Yeah,
from
that is
other
the thing.
folks. So
I think
I would
early,
always say if you're thinking about like if you're worried about your child in the same way that like you don't run to the doctor every time they, sniff or blow their nose and go, oh my gosh, right? Like I think they might have pneumonia. You make some judgment as a parent, but when you're starting to worry about your child and you're seeing the things Nick was talking about, I always encourage parents to reach out.
yeah, I think that's the key. And that is where I feel like sometimes it is cultural. I mean, in our case, I would say we did seek out the help, but even knowing what help we have to seek out, who is there out there to, what kind of resources do we need? It is so hard because of the stigma around, because of no conversations around. And that's one of the things that we want to do here, right? Because when my child was going through it, I don't think anybody in my immediate circle or another circle, like if we talk about concentric circles of socialization, I don't think I knew anybody in two or three circles who had gone through what we were going through. And then later we got to know that there were people, but it's just because nobody talks about it, it doesn't come up. But I think, Daniel, you're right. Like the moment we do have questions, it doesn't hurt to go and seek help. Now, going into that, right, into that topic, and that's where I would ask Nick. So let's say my child, I feel I found something in their backpack or I saw something on their laptop or whatever it might be. And I do see some of, maybe not all of them, but some of the signs that you mentioned. Now, where do we go for help? Like, and I will say that because when I was trying to seek out people for this panel, I had very tough time. It took me almost a month and I have access to 20, 40 different psychologists and psychiatrists. And in spite of that, it took me this long to look for a person who can speak about it because there are very few people who are into substance use or addictive behavior treatment. So where should the parents take these kids? They don't want to take them into rehab because I was getting people from rehab. I think that's like the next step. So what is the step?
It is, yeah. I mean, if you think about the kind of lowest levels of care, right, which is something community based, right, outpatient, maybe it's once a week, maybe it's less, up to something that's more intensive outpatient multiple times a week, up to something that is, in the inpatient setting, right, detoxes, residential treatment, rehabs, and so forth. That's not typically the first step for anyone,
Yeah,
right, unless the
exactly.
problem is so severe that it immediately has to get there, right? We're talking about essentially like life-threatening substance use behavior where something like withdrawal could become a medical crisis, right? So, if we're not at that point, and I think that's not what we're talking about here, one of the places that you can start is with someone who maybe you already have a trusting relationship with, right? So while they're not specifically treaters of these kinds of conditions, if the kid has like a long-standing relationship with a pediatrician, or they have a relationship with someone in the school setting, right? And I know there can be some wariness around that, but there often are advisors or counselors at school, right? That's your kind of like first line step. If it's reached a point, and potentially just a step for referrals as well, right? So schools oftentimes have a referral network that they'll work with. Medical doctors may as well. Beyond that, looking for practices that specialize in the age range that we're talking about, right? So there are many practices that only see adults, right? Or only specialize in certain presentations, right? So
Right.
being able to find something that is within your local community that specializes in both the age range that you're looking for and then whatever the presentation is, right? Some places only focus on mental health, some places only focus on substance use, some do a combination of both. So it takes a little legwork, and that therapeutic relationship that someone may develop if they enter treatment is so critically important that you may not get it on the first try. And I
Mm.
think that kind of persistence in finding something that's going to be a good fit is something that I really want to emphasize. And I think also back to Danielle's point, in my line of work, I take a pretty broad view of what I would consider, relatively normal human behavior, experimentation, and so forth. But one of the things that really stuck with me from when I was training was somebody said, when you see something that's outside of that normal range, even if it's broad, you typically know it. Like if you're noticing something that's really different about your kid, you're seeing a sudden change or an intense change, you're seeing a physical change, and you're really worried, better to walk through that door and see what happens with the knowledge that you can always walk back out, right? So that's what I would say is there's a few
Mm.
different ways that you can find access to treatment, right? But trying it out, better that it was a false alarm than the opposite.
So I guess probably like even if somebody is thinking that they do have seem to have child seems to have some sort of addiction issue, maybe possibly, probably their first stop shop should be maybe a therapist, the local therapist or therapy center which is local, and then maybe they can get into, or they can probably you know refer them to something different if they find something. Would
I
you
think you really
consider
want someone to be evaluated, and then from there, those recommendations are made. I'll also mention that with health insurance now, and it all based with there's a lot of databases for there's a lot to it, right? But
that?
typically
That's
now you
another
can
one big
search
1 hour
for
conversation, right?
it would be, but you can search for specific treatment that you're looking for or conditions that you're looking for, and typically you can get a list within 25 miles of where you live, right? Again, whether they're
Yeah,
accepting patients,
and
whether it's a good fit,
that's
all those things. Yeah, I agree.
I'm not going to say anything, but to tell you the truth, that was one of my go-to thing when I was looking for help for my child, especially because it was during COVID. That and Psychology Today, and I didn't have really good, you know, experience or success with it. Like most of the doctors that I know now, or most of the therapists that I know now, none of them came on my radar at all. Like, that's one thing that I always wonder, what if I had taken my child to this person first or that person first? And that's why I think it's important for us to really do what, uh, you know, bringing in all different kinds of resources in out in open, because we just don't know what all resources. I mean, there are probably, I know for our fair, we are going to have 46 different resources who are coming. But I'm pretty sure within Livingston, there are 50 different therapists. And
So
we don't
Shilpa,
know.
I also want to mention that, you've hit on one of the most challenging pieces here, right? Which is that there are real gaps in our mental health system. There's not enough providers, and adolescents very often fall through the cracks in many ways. That said, one of the things that we really try to do at the Addiction Research Center is also make it easy for people to find resources and help. And so if you go to the Rutgers Addiction Research Center, addiction.rutgers.edu, there is a Get Help button right at the top. And we also put on there some resources that they're not exhaustive or whatnot, but other community agencies that we know and partner with. So a couple quick things. In New Jersey, there is actually a hotline that you can call and give information about current symptoms, concerns, where you live, insurance type, et cetera, and they will talk about different programs that are could be available to you. In addition, I'll just mention offhand a couple of the organizations that I really like are Partnership to End Addiction, which has a lot of resources for parents, all evidence-based, and Shatterproof, which is another nonprofit started by an individual who lost his son to addiction. And they have, as part of their services, the ability to help connect people with various treatment options as well. So
That's
those are just a
fantastic.
few things that are, if my child were struggling, are kind of places that I turn to or that I would start.
I think I would probably offer Danielle and Nick. I would get all these resources from you guys and put it out for the rest of the people who are listening in or who might be interested in actually, looking into it. Definitely. We are coming to almost 5 minutes. Let's see if there are any questions. I know I had. Would this is a question. So there are adults now who need substances who likely would have been classified by today's standards if they had been tested. So
I'm
I
sorry, what was the question? I missed
the
it.
what's the question? So would would there be could there be parents? I'm pretty sure, yeah, from today's standard they could have been but I think it's actually the other way around because the standards have gone worse, right? Because before what their substances were available to them at that age were much less potent versus what they are right now, is what Nick and Danielle are saying. So they might have taken a long time for those substances to have the effect, while their kids, if they think that they are the same standards, that's not something they should be really thinking about. And I think that's what you were saying, right, Nick, that today's parents should understand that it's the potency of these substances is not same as what they were getting in 60s and 80s and 90s.
Certainly with THC based products, right? Although, as Danielle mentioned earlier, even things like opioids, right? When you think about heroin versus fentanyl, when you think about the powders and pills in general, the supply has become so adulterated that there's risk, even in kids taking what they think is like a pharmaceutical pill that may have been pressed right in a laboratory as opposed to manufactured by a pharmaceutical company. So benzodiazepines in particular, your Xanax and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
no.
I'm not sure. I'm still not 100% sure what the question is in there, but um, yes, definitely high risk with the potency and adulteration of substances in the 2026 drug market.
Yeah, I think I see another question which we probably have addressed it. What are the typical signs of substance abuse parents should watch at home? And Nick, you talked about that. How much mood swing is considered normal for the developing brain of a teenager? And how much abnormal is considered normal? Would you say that it's actually dependent on the parents? Because I sometimes I feel maybe I don't have that kind of patience versus some other parents might have more patience. So
Danielle, I don't know if you have thoughts on that. I mean,
No,
that's a really
I'll
tough one
throw
to
out
answer. Like,
I'll throw out one thought, and then I'm going to let Nick, who's on the clinical side, really take it. But one of the things is, parents will often ask me, "Is this normal?" And I say, "You know what's normal? It's normal for behavior to fall on a bell curve, which means it's going to be normal for some kids to be very low, and it's going to be normal for some kids to be very high." So I think that's important to keep in mind because it's less about is this normal or is this abnormal and more about is this interfering in a negative way with this child's life, with their relationships with their parents, with their peers at school. If the answer to those things is yes, that's when I
Then
think it is worth talking to Nick or someone like him, right? Like, meaning talking to someone who can really work with the family and with the child on what's going on here. So, Nick, I'll let you,
yeah,
weigh in
that's a
with
great
more
way
of
to
your
put it. Like
clinical
the
advice.
clinical term, thinking about like impairment and functioning, right, in these kind of major areas of someone's life, whether they're an adolescent or an adult. But I like to think of it on very much a case by case basis, right? Because everyone is different. So, is there a shift in behavior, right, that's fairly sudden or intense, maybe even more drawn out, but starts to really have that impact that for this specific kid, not any kid, right? Because teenagers can be moody, right? Irritability, some of that apathy, right? Some of the almost physical things that we see, sleeping more, like all of this is so natural, right? That to say, like, well, which is it, right? But if it's your kid and you know your kid and you're observing a big change in one direction or another, that's worth kind of digging into, right? Not compared to the world, but just with your sample of one. So some
Absolutely.
of it's a judgment call. Again, better to kind of err on the side of caution, right? And also just ask, right? Get
Yeah.
curious.
No,
That's what I would say.
absolutely.
If you're noticing a change, just observe what you're noticing.
We did not actually, we are coming to the top of the hour. So maybe I do want to touch this topic if you guys are okay to go 5 minutes beyond. Gaming addiction. We didn't touch upon that. But would you consider that as like in the same bucket as everything else that we talked about? Whether, like, can we literally replace gaming or for that matter for gambling or any of these addiction, even social media for that matter, everything with what we talked about substance abuse?
Danielle, this is, I think, more your area of expertise, but the way that I think about any kind of like behavioral presentation,
Addict, yeah.
it could be gambling, it could be shopping, it could be sex, it could be social media, it could be substance use, it could be video games, any of these things that are so stimulating and engaging for folks and that have the capacity for repetitive, kind of compulsive behavior because of that reward pathway that was described, I think, so eloquently earlier. That to me, all of that behavior can get kind of lumped under one big umbrella. Now, obviously, the individual presentations and the
Yeah,
impact and the potential harms are different for each of those. But I think that that kind of mechanism of neurological action is not radically dissimilar.
different.
And Nick, to support exactly what Nick just said too, in our big studies now, we can actually, we've found thousands of genetic variants, which we know are associated with increased rate of substance use problems. And we can literally create risk scores for people by summing them up and weighting all these by their effect size. So for any one of us, we can create kind of a genetic propensity toward addictive behavior. And guess what? Those same scores that predict substance use problems predict all the things that Nick was talking about too. They predict heavy social media use, they predict gambling problems, they predict heavy gaming, etc. So because, as he was saying, they're activating the same neural pathways. They are in fact designed to activate those reward pathways.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think tonight's conversation, I mean, we could go on for another hour. I can see that. It is just the beginning, right? It is, we are just scratching the surface, sort of. Over the coming weeks, we will be continuing these discussions in on different topics through our virtual panels, and then we gather in person at the Youth Mental Wellness Fair with everybody on January 25th, a space where we would be connecting, learning, and through community support. If there is one message, I think I'm trying to digest all the stuff that we spoke. If I have to leave with one message from here, I think I would, as a parent, think about it as connection is our strongest protector for our kids. That could be the protective factor. I hear from Nick and also from Danielle, you multiple times. It's curiosity is more powerful than control. Better said than done. I do not know whether I can even manage sometimes, because I don't even know sometimes as a parent that I'm really seeking control, or I'm controlling my child. But that curiosity, and I have to be very, very thoughtful about that. But that's what I heard from you guys. And then early conversations really matter. Is there something else that you guys would like to add?
I will just throw in that, when we think about genetic predispositions and whatnot, and I talk about this a lot in my book, often as parents, we're worrying. Like, we're like, oh, this child is displaying behavior problems, or they're using substances, or they're talking back, or, whatever it might be. My reminder to parents is there's good and there's not so good associated with all of our kids' traits, right? So you might have a highly impulsive child who's pushing back a lot as an adolescent, and you're thinking, this is so challenging to raise this child. I know, I had that child. But you also want a child who is going to question things, right? Want to try new things, want to make a mark in the world. Sometimes the things that are most frustrating to us as parents, or most challenging, are actually characteristics that can be channeled into these other wonderful traits. It's even true of anxiety, right? A little bit of anxiety, like, it can make people think things through. It can make them really feel for their friends, etc. So there's good and not so good associated with everything. And I think part of our role as parents is to, accentuate and help our kids understand the good associated with their kind of dispositions and traits, and then to help them recognize potential pitfalls and put in place support systems, whether it's through talking to a professional like Nick, or other kinds of ways that we can work with and support our kids to reduce the likelihood that they will engage in some of those behaviors which might take them astray.
Thank you. Thank you. I have to give an extra hug to my child tonight. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists and sharing their expertise. And thank you to every parent and caregiver who showed up tonight. This is how hopefully the change begins, one conversation at a time. And have a good night, everyone. I will be talking again. I will be meeting you guys again on Wednesday with another panel for preteens. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Give me 1 second. I'm going to stop this.